These girls would tear apart if you did anything like that. Yeah, I think that's they never gave it to the police because we've seen the police. So it's easy to get somebody. I never remember. It was fun. Although yeah, right. Yeah, wait a second. Right, remember that, yeah. Never traffic there. Yeah. 75 max something. That's I say you can get an increase. Somebody that's earning not only are we not giving you what's 15 laying off, it was like 30, it might have been about 35 firefighters and 20 cops. So there was more police, more firefighters than was police, but still they were getting paid off more police officers. Yeah. In essence, they were getting, it was like a swing of like 30, it was like 35. It's 50 minutes. At that time, fly, Really? flew by my exit once I was on the phone.
No, I'm not going to be with this. They're lovely young ladies.
I got off every day. I did that for 5-10 years when I was working out there. I'm driving, you know, I used to get off on the interstate. That's 175. I passed it, but keep going. Where am I? I turned around and literally
I'm happy about like
I turned around and was back. Is that good? Or is that
Check.
I did send you 3 copies.
Oh, I feel better. Okay. Take that. He knows exactly what he's
Just do the first. Just do here. So this is what they do. Just do the first one.
We could probably just do the time too.
Just these 2?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's great. It's great to see you. Good time.
All right, good evening, everyone. We're going to get started right now so we can get moving along. Everyone is here now that's going to be a panelist for this event. And just as a general rule, we're going to try to hold all the questions until the end, because the first time we did this, it kind of, I think a lot of the questions, a lot of people had the same question. They didn't want to wait, or they wanted to wait till the end. So we're going to let all three presenters go ahead and put their information forward, and then we'll have plenty of time at the end for question and answers. I think everybody at least got to address their issue at the last event. So again, good evening. My name's Phil Phelps. I'm a state representative for Michigan's 49th State House District. That's here in Genesee County. I have a portion of the city of Flint, Flushing, Swartz Creek, Mount Morris, and all of Flint Township. I'm in my third term in the State House, but I was a member of the State House when we rewrote, or we actually created the Licensure Act that is kind of the part of the reason we're here today, kind of talking about the medical marijuana as a resource for people to treat a lot of symptoms and diseases that they might have not had that option to before Michigan created the ballot initiative in 2008 that created the availability of medical marijuana for everyone. So I will be able to answer some questions on that at the end too, in case one of our presenters does not get to that. So tonight we have three presenters that are going to share information with you. Our first presenter is going to be Dr. Nakadar. He's a physician and the governor's appointee on the Statutory Medical Marijuana Advisory Panel. Our second presenter is Dr. Smith. He's the Director of Research at the Institute for Neurosurgery and Neuroscience. And then also we have Thomas Nafso. He's an attorney at Butzel Long, and he's a former LARA attorney, which is the Licensing and Regulatory Affairs Department. And he was on the Attorney General's office as a former prosecutor. So we're going to start with our first presenter, Dr. Nakadar. The doctor is a former Detroit area native and has been practicing medicine since 2008. He worked for the Henry Ford Health System as a hospitalist at Henry Ford Wyandotte Hospital. Throughout his years of practice, he developed a unique understanding about health and symptoms that affect patients on a daily basis. He started a separate clinic in 2010 where he focused on lifestyle modifications and a holistic approach. He began becoming familiar with the medical cannabis and started to focus his interest in in this area. He now has a vast knowledge of the plant, cannabinoids, processing, dosages, and practical applications. Dr. Nakadar has become one of the leaders in the medical cannabis field. His clinical experience, medical knowledge, and treatment of thousands of patients has given him an excellent reputation. He has recently been appointed by the governor to the Medical Marijuana Advisory Panel. Medical professionals, lawmakers, and regulatory agencies and law enforcement have looked towards Dr. Nakadar for valuable input in various issues regarding medical cannabis. And the doctor is our first presenter, and we're very lucky to have him share his knowledge with us on this.
Thank you. All right, hello everyone. Thanks for coming to our symposium today. I'm going to be just talking about the basic medical science and application of cannabis. So just to give you a brief overview, I'm just going to talk a little bit about cannabis history, plant biology, active compounds, a little bit of the pharmacology, and again, more about the practical application is where I'll focus. So cannabis has been a plant that's been around for many years. There's evidence of it dating back down to 12,000 years ago. So this is not a new substance or something new that is unfamiliar to us. Just to give you a brief introduction to the plant itself, if you haven't seen it before, you kind of see the full plant here on the left side, and you can see the leaf that we're usually kind of associated with medical cannabis, but the actual product is within the flower material itself, and that's what we have on the right side. Frames of that are magnified going down. Excuse me. The main thing to note there is that that last frame is what's called the trichome, and that's the component of the cannabis that contains the cannabinoids that we're going to be talking about. We have two distinct strains of cannabis, and this is more from a classification standpoint. One is sativa, and the other one is indica. Those are the two main terms that people kind of throw around in terms of determining which kinds of cannabis it is. They have slightly different effects and characteristics, not only in the plant morphology itself and how it actually grows, but some of the compounds it produces does produce slightly different effects in different situations. Cannabinoids, these are the compounds that we're going to talk about, and this is what's actually in those little trichomes that we kind of saw in the first picture. There's many different cannabinoids. The main interesting one for us is delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, which is also known as THC. This is what's responsible for the euphoric effects, as well as many of the medicinal properties as well. And then this is the component that is actually classified as a Schedule I drug by the DEA, and we'll get a little bit more into that. The other compounds there are different identified cannabinoids. You'll hear the term CBD quite a bit, and that's usually the term given to these compounds that don't contain THC. So that's really the main difference. There's a lot of different classifications and a lot of different details about it, but for the most part, we're either talking about THC or we're talking about CBD. So that's really the two separate ones. A little bit about how this works. So this is like a nerve terminal. It may not make a whole lot of sense, but what's important to know is that we have these receptors, CB1 receptors and CB2 receptors, and this is part of our own cannabinoid system. And we also produce our own endogenous cannabinoids, which are cannabinoids made by our own body. And those are the 2-AG and anandamide, and there's a few more that they're starting to identify now. And those compounds work in our body on those receptors. But when we consume cannabinoids, the CBD, THC, these are the receptors it's working on, is CB1 and CB2. And the activation of those receptors causes some differences in the way the chemicals between nerve endings are transmitted. And that's really what allows us to figure out what the effects are and how it kind of works. Unlike other medications, we're not really changing a whole lot of what's happening here or the amounts, but it's really more about how long some of those effects last and when those appropriate chemical signals are transmitted. So you have a few different ways that you can use cannabis. There's of course, the smoked version that everybody kind of talks about, smoking it from a joint. There's also vaporizers that can produce products for inhalation without the products of combustion. So the important things to know about inhaled version is that it's pretty rapid onset of action, and you're going to get this mostly effective within the internal circulation. So your internal organs, your brain, your heart, your lungs are going to get majority of the cannabinoids and THC when you inhale it. You can also eat it, and there's also other pharmaceutical forms of this as well, and the pharmaceutical form is called durabinol. And we kind of have a lot of our studies and information also in terms of the bioavailability and absorption of these things through those medications. But the main thing, again, to take away is that when you ingest it, it's a slower absorption. You're getting a smaller pool of cannabinoids to a larger pool of blood, and you actually get that circulating more towards the periphery with less effect from a euphoric side. And that's all really when it comes down to dosing this, and we'll get into that as well. You have a few other ways too. Rectal, there's rectal suppositories. People use that to improve the cannabinoid uptake without having the THC effect because it's absorbed through the rectum. There's just some differences in how that drug is metabolized, so it has less of effect to the brain, but you can actually increase the amount of cannabinoids you're taking. They have lotions, creams, different topical applications as well, useful in a lot of pain situations, neuropathy, as well as arthritis, psoriasis, eczema, different skin conditions as well. So metabolism occurs mainly in the liver, but you do have some of it happening in the renal system as well. So pain management is probably the number one thing that I deal with in the office, and it has a lot of different benefits from when it comes to pain, and this is kind of a slide to tell more about why it has different effects on pain. It's not like our regular opiate medications that actually deaden pain. So if someone has a broken arm, I can give them enough narcotic, and they won't feel it when I push or touch on that arm. But it's not the same thing with cannabis. There's not an amount of cannabis I can give somebody and then touch their arm without them having pain. And that's kind of the important thing to know as well. And the real benefit kind of happens from a global standpoint. So it's not just about the actual pain sensation we're decreasing, but we're improving their levels of fatigue. They're actually able to take a lot of their other medications on a regular basis, and that makes them more effective. And then we've also used it in before physical therapy and other types of therapy that people go through that kind of they develop pain in. So it's not what we always kind of think about, I'm in pain and I take a medication, but it really kind of is a way to use the medication and still can continue doing other treatments and therapies. Also, it reduces anxiety, and anxiety is a big problem in terms of things that happen when someone has multiple chronic illnesses. Neurological disorders, that's one of our other areas of interest, especially with multiple sclerosis, epilepsy, different other neurological and muscular disorders. It's had a lot of benefits, especially controlling the symptoms, which usually include similar ones like spasticity, tremor, bladder dysfunction, things like that. And we're really seeing a lot of different more practical applications and uses where this is becoming something where people are able to kind of use this for their symptoms without having to take multiple medications. We can kind of cover a variety of symptoms with one medication. Dosing, so this is probably a more interesting area. There's no real specific dosing guidelines. This isn't like other medications where there's a package insert and there's a lot of information about it. Much of this has been kind of something I've figured out from using it within patients, and a lot of it from the patients and caregivers and different people in the industry kind of sharing information. So, typically we start slow, and we're not talking about, again, smoking this from a standpoint of inhalation. We're typically using capsules that are milligram dose based. So, we can extract cannabis now, we can extract all those cannabinoids, and we can kind of separate a lot of that out, a lot of the other plant material out, and have products that we can really rely on the dosing. So milligram dosage is much more applicable in this situation now, and we have a variety of different dosages that someone can use. So we would start them slow, kind of titrate them up to what they tolerate based on their symptoms, and basically everyone has their own dose, so there's no set dose that I would start on any one person. You just have to figure that out kind of as you try it out. The important thing to know is that there's no toxic limits. So, those CB1 and CB2 receptors that we were talking about where these compounds actually work, don't exist in your brainstem, where you control your heart rate, your respiratory rate, your blood pressure, and those vital organ vital signs that we use as a metric there. So really, it's very safe, and for the most part, you won't have any kind of major toxic toxic effects. The adverse effects that we do know are mostly short-term memory loss, and that's really limited to the time of use. And the other issue is cyclic vomiting syndrome. Although I haven't seen too many cases of this myself, it has been reported, and seems to be some association with chronic or excessive cannabis use. There's no reported deaths from any amount of cannabis used. They estimate the lethal dose to be 30 milligrams per kilogram IV, which really isn't a form or usage that is actually used. I just kind of have it up there for completeness. And there's no real known drug interactions. It can increase the sedating effect of certain medications, but for the most part, there's no interaction. So qualifying conditions. Some of you may know this, but this is the state of Michigan's 2 categories that they allow medical cannabis use for. So category A is a list of conditions, and category B is a list of symptoms. Most of them go hand in hand when it comes to the different things that you're dealing with. Things on the left typically cause the things on the right, but there's a lot of other conditions that still cause the symptoms on the right, and a lot of times they're conditions that cause multiple symptoms. And so these are the different things that we can actually use cannabis for. So as you can see, it covers quite a bit of different medical problems or conditions when you use category B. Legal issues and risk from a physician standpoint. There isn't much risk. The state law protects the physicians very well. Patients are obviously subject to all the laws and rules that the state of Michigan has placed, and for the most part, they're not difficult to follow. They're not stringent, and still allow for pretty practical use of the cannabis. It's considered a recommendation only from a physician, because we're not legally able to prescribe. Prescribing DEA Schedule I drugs is actually illegal. So this is the way the state law kind of worded this to make sure that we weren't causing other legal infractions. The process, we evaluate the patient, which is review of the conditions, their medical records, and then we'll kind of do our own evaluation otherwise. We make a recommendation based on that situation, and basically go on to educate the patient. This is probably the most important part of what I do is educating patients on the basic effects, the rules, and how to use it. Not everybody who comes in, as a lot of people think, are people who use this all the time. Many of these people are patients who have never used cannabis before and don't really otherwise have any particular method or way of acclimating themselves to it. We'll give referrals to qualified cannabis professionals, as I like to call them. And that's really people who are somewhat trained to deal with patients and medical conditions itself, and kind of the situations that arise when patients are trying medications and dealing with other things. And then we'll follow up with the patient, so basically evaluate and maintain effective treatment, just if they're having any other issues from that standpoint. Most of the statistics and everything are reportable, so there's a lot of information that the state actually goes through and keeps track of in terms of how many prescriptions or recommendations are given, and the types of qualifying conditions that are actually submitted. These are my sources, just for you to look at. I can always share that with you as well. But there is a lot of good research and good information that's out there. It's just sifting through that and applying it practically that's kind of important. But that will kind of segue into our next talk here. Thank you.
Thank you again, Doctor. It's really amazing to see all the amount of research on this, considering, I mean, a decade ago and pretty much 2 decades ago across the country, governments thought of this as a drug that had no medical use or no scientific use. So it's really great to see the amount of research he is doing. Our next speaker is Dr. Richard Smith. He is the research director at the Institute of Neuroscience and Neurology. Since May of 2010, he has handled biomedical and clinical research as well as business development. Previously, Dr. Smith was the vice president at IAA Threefold Sensors in Ann Arbor. He was a senior scientist at BioQuant in Ann Arbor and a research associate for the Department of Internal Medicine at the University of Michigan Hospitals. He was also a postdoctoral research fellow for the Department of Pathology, Microbiology, and Immunology for the University of Michigan Medical School. His education, he has a Master's of Business Administration from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, go Blue. He has a PhD in biochemistry from Wesleyan University, and he has a BS in biology and chemistry from Millersville University. I'd like to welcome up Dr. Smith for a presentation.
Thank you. I hope I can find my slides. Where's Notter? That does look somehow familiar. Maybe that's it.
That's it.
Is it?
Yep.
Yeah.
Thank you.
This reminds me of how many doctors does it take, right?
Thanks, Sorry. Good evening, all of you. I appreciate you being here. And for any of you here who were here before, you've probably you've already pretty well absorbed this topic, and probably are an advocate of this as well. I think that this is a really important area, largely because it's providing a medication that, if you think of it as a medication, not as a recreational drug, it's providing a medication that actually has a therapeutic effect with virtually no side effects. And it's hard to find that sort of thing out there. And what you do find out there is drugs that are alternatives to cannabis that are quite powerful and have many side effects. So it's pretty logical that we move forward on this thing, and I appreciate that. So I'm going to give you a little, where's forward? There we go. Medical cannabis is just one of many agents that are used that are derived from plants. And I just have a little list here of some of them. Many or all of you have used aspirin, I'm guessing, unless it doesn't work for you. And many other drugs on that list all of those things are derived from plants. We get a lot of good stuff from plants. So the first question is, where does the current use of medical cannabis come from? And Dr. Nakadar gave a really nice background on this. But there's evidence is known for something like 60,000 years. The oldest written evidence on botanical medications in general, and you don't find writings that are terribly old, so just to have one is pretty amazing. It was on a 5,000-year-old slab from Sumeria that included 12 recipes for a variety of alkaloids. It doesn't mention cannabis, but it's within the same ballpark. The earliest reference that I've seen to cannabis was from a Chinese emperor, 2900 before the Common Era, which would be almost 5,000 years ago. And he noted it possessed both yin and yang principles. So you might want to take note of that, just in case those are important to you. In terms of the specific pharmacologic use, the earliest record I found was in a Chinese pharmacopoeia from 1500 BCE. And moving closer to the present, we have writings from Zoroaster in the Middle East, about 700 before the Common Era. And moving to the birth of our own nation, we have three very famous people, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and John Adams, who all grew what they were probably thinking of as hemp. because they were probably using it as rope, because it's a very tough fiber and you can use it to put around your animal and put around your wagon and allow the animal to drag the wagon. They probably were not talking about it in terms of its pharmacologic effect, but there's no record of that I know, so it is possible. Let's see. So moving into the effectiveness of this drug, I found a note in prevention.com, which is sort of a populist magazine that refers to medical treatments, giving scores of the current use of cannabis for a number of indications. And these, of course, are due to change as people's use of the drug changes. But as you can see here, it's extremely effective for nausea relief, cancer, and for epilepsy. It's very effective for multiple sclerosis and for what's called burning pain. Less so for some other things, Alzheimer's and PTSD. So there are a suite of positive effects from this thing. There are a number of gaps in current research, however, and as you can imagine, it's a little difficult to do research, given that the federal government is basically prohibited doing research on a federal level. So getting research funds is something that people have to scramble to do. One of which would be the notion of what is the herbal synergy of the different active components of cannabis. Everybody's heard of THC. A lot of people have heard of cannabidiols, and as Dr. Nakadar pointed out, there are a lot of other chemicals in there that can be presented in different concentrations to one another in different parts of the plant or in different cultivars of the plant. So you have that kind of thing. You have things like the pharmacokinetics, which is what's the rate at which the drug takes an effect, cannabis and other drug interactions, and a variety of other things. So there are a number of research gaps that really need to be addressed. Some of the things related to safety have more to do with the production of the plant. For example, heavy metals will appear in certain soils. So that's a concern. But those things are expected to be tested for in any product that's used commercially. So what should be considered in doing clinical research studies on cannabis? Dosing it may be hard to quantify unless you have a highly reproducible batch of it. I'm not sure how that works, but I presume that it can be done. The notion of herbal synergy has not been widely tested in clinical trials. But most of these issues can be tested if there's a resolution to do that. What do the clinical findings and the experience of practitioners say? Obviously, we know that there is significant pain control. We know that it may become a non-addicting substitute for opioid drugs. And there are a variety of other conditions that can be optimized with the use of cannabis. A number of gaps that exist in this based on simply quality control. That may be more likely to be true of the recreational product. So, I don't think regulators are going to be too concerned about recreational uses. But the standardization of all of this is certainly possible, and if at some point this becomes regulated in the way that alcohol is regulated, then all of these sources of adverse effects themselves would be regulated, and you would know just how much heavy metals and other things you'd be taking along with your cannabis. I've found few reliable medical studies. I think probably the main reason for that is people can't get grants to do it. Grants come from the federal government, and the federal government is not in favor. So it pretty much closes that door. The variance on available active components is not something that's terribly well controlled. For example, the VA in that statement in the middle will not conduct research into whether medical marijuana would help veterans suffering from PTSD. That seems a little closed-minded to me, but that's what they have to say. And there are a variety of other examples of societal rejection of cannabis, and obviously there are what I would call most sentient people seem to think it's not such a bad thing for us to at least understand the potential good things and the harms. And one of the most important good things is reduction of opioid use. I talked about this a little bit the last time we had this meeting. There was a study of 185 patients at the University of Michigan School of Public Health, and they all were using cannabis, and 64% of them experienced a reduction in their need for opioid drugs. They also had fewer side effects, and if you've ever taken, if you have a horrible accident of some kind and you're put on opioid drugs, you're probably not going to remember much. You'll wake up with a headache and a lot of other things. So, there are a few studies that are out there. Cannabis has been demonstrated from another University of Michigan study to be more effective for severe centralized chronic pain, and also has been noted to reduce chronic opioid use in the public press. In 2014, over 28,000 fewer reported overdose deaths due to opioids. So one of the problems with opioids, aside from that, is their cost is skyrocketing. It was noted in 2006 that naloxone was $1 a dose. Now it's about $40 a dose. I don't think anybody in this room has seen their salary go up 40-fold in that period. So that is, that's pretty crazy. An estimate that I found on obviously an advocacy site called Canabis.net, but they estimate that opioid use would be reduced by 11% already by substituting cannabis. So one would expect that further use of cannabis could reduce the use of opioid drugs. Of course, there's a huge industry around opioid drugs that is going to say, wait a second, let's just support what it says in the federal law already. So a lot of it comes down to that. In terms of the overdose frequency in the USA, I just grabbed this. This is off of the CDC, Center for Disease Control website, and it's showing overdose deaths from 2000 to 2016. And as you can see, that blue line for synthetic opioids, that's going to be literally through the roof. It's on its way there already. And that's a bit over 2 years ago. So I don't know what the data are now, but it can't be less. And that's a variety of drugs that are just out there and one can take them. And what I would suggest is a reasonable substitute. Gotta go the right direction. Overdose deaths due to medical cannabis, very close to zero. You may draw your own conclusion from that. I'd also like to remind you that therapeutic cannabis is recognized by FDA for specific medical indications. So it's not completely outside of the system. And an experienced physician, as Dr. Nakadar can offer a lot of assistance in guiding patients through the experience of using an agent that's very different from something they've already taken. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Doctor. Very impressive research, especially with the epidemic we're facing now with opioids, and not just in our area, but across America. Some of those results are very, very impressive, and leads us to be more optimistic about a potential resolution to this crisis. Before we go to our next guest, we've had a number of notable people kind of walk in as we were going here, and I wanted just to introduce some of them, because part of these events is to try to bring local government together and try to show that there's support for this industry and support for the research that's going on. So I want to acknowledge some of the current electeds or government officials that are here. First, Representative Tim Sneller is here. He represents the 50th District. Hi, Tim. one of the newest city council members and one of the youngest city council member ever elected to the city of Flint. Santino Guerra is here. I think he might be out in the hallway. But we've got former State Rep Lee Gonzalez is here, and he's now the Government Affairs Director of the Michigan Department of Civil Rights. We've got John Potberry here from the Genesee County Prosecutor's Office. And we also have former Mayor of Lansing and candidate for governor in 2010, Verge Bonero. So now with the third portion of our presentations today, I want to bring up Mr. Nafso. Mr. Nafso is a former Assistant Attorney General with the State of Michigan Department of Attorney General, and prior to that, he was a prosecuting attorney for Wayne County. He has extensive administrative, criminal, civil litigation, and government relations experience. Mr. Nafso has first chaired more than 100 combined jury and bench trials to verdict and has held hundreds of administrative hearings. During his tenure at the Department of Attorney General, Nafso represented several state agencies, including the Department of Treasury, the Michigan Gaming Control Board, Michigan Department of Licensing and Regulation, and the Michigan Liquor Control Commission. Mr. Nafso has drafted legislation and administrative rules and has extensive experience with the Michigan Administrative Procedures Act. His regulatory and compliance experience has made Nafso a leading source on the Michigan Medical Marijuana Act and the Michigan Medical Marijuana Facilities Act. Mr. Nafso earned his law degree and MBA from the University of Detroit Mercy and is a graduate of Michigan State's Michigan Political Leadership Program. Nafso currently serves on his local board of zoning and appeals, and we'd like to bring up Mr. Nafso for his portion of the presentation.
Thank you, Representative Phelps, and welcome everybody. Now for the fun part, the dive into the law here. We're going to address a few things in my short time with you here this evening. We'll look at some federal issues that have arose, look at the current status of medical marijuana in Michigan, and we'll also ask ourselves, what does this look like on a local level? And we'll talk about ordinances, what they look like in certain places, and also talk about the community and public safety. First thing we want to look at here is the Sessions memo. There's been a lot of talk about this memo. There's been a lot of articles written on it. Not a lot of people have seen the memo. So this is it. One single page, 3 paragraphs and footnotes. And what does it really say? I mean, initially I'll say not that much. So the first paragraph talks about, well, generally marijuana is illegal. These activities serve as the basis for prosecution of crimes, and it talks about some ancillary crimes. It doesn't directly say, there's an issue with marijuana itself. It says money laundering, unlicensed money transmitter, Bank Secrecy Act violations. So the memo starts off talking about these more white-collar offenses, saying, well, we may not directly go after these things, but let's put these things on the radar. If you're not paying your taxes, you're laundering money, this needs to go on the radar. Next paragraph is really reiterating that this is a directive to the 55 or so appointed U.S. attorneys throughout the country. So we have 2 here in Michigan. We have the Western District, Eastern District. The recent appointee to the Eastern District is Matthew Schneider, who actually spoke on this and said, this isn't one of my priorities. The reason that he addressed that was because of this paragraph. So this paragraph is really saying, prioritize what you want to prosecute. And we have a representative here from the prosecutor's office, I'm sure, who can speak to that as well. But prosecutors follow well-established principles. They decide what to prosecute based on certain considerations, resources, and priorities set by the Attorney General, seriousness of the crime, deterrent effect of criminal activity, and the cumulative impact particular crimes have on the community. So again, that was the paragraph that the U.S. Attorney to the Eastern District was speaking to. He said, well, I acknowledge this paragraph, I acknowledge what this says, but you know what, at this time, this is not a priority. We're going after gangs, we're going after violent crimes, we're going after those different things. And the last part is really what most of the headlines were about, and it's about this Cole memo, which was a previous memo from 2012. And so this memo states that it's being rescinded. So it says previous nationwide guidance specific to marijuana enforcement is unnecessary and is rescinded effective immediately. And so the idea there is, again, that memo just said, we're not going to go after these marijuana offenders. We're not going to really devote government resources toward the enforcement of marijuana. So this really just returned us to the status quo. But effectively, if somebody's violating the law, they're violating the law. So really this is talking about, again, back to the first paragraph, money laundering, unlicensed money transmitter, Bank Secrecy Act. So those are the things it's trying to put on the radar, and this is really going to be handled on a district-by-district basis across the country. But there hasn't, now about a month and a half in since this memo, there really hasn't been a real change in policy across the country as far as anyone can tell. Medical marijuana in Michigan, dating back to 2008, we had the Michigan Medical Marijuana Act. We heard a lot about, there was a 5 to 1 patient ratio. There could be a caregiver. You're a licensed caregiver, you can have your 5 patients. The number 72, you may have heard a lot. Each patient can have 12 plants. The caregiver can have 12 plants. You can grow 72 plants. So we worked within that framework for about 8 years. We started seeing dispensaries pop up. Those dispensaries were operating in what's been called the gray area for some time, until in 2016, the Medical Marijuana Facilities Licensing Act came into play. That's the new framework which authorizes, it's a 5-tier system. You have your growers, processors, provisioning centers, which are dispensaries. You have safety compliance facilities, which test the marijuana, and you have secure transporters. The idea is you have this 5-tier system that services the industry that passed late 16, and applications for medical marijuana applications to the state began as of December 15th, 2017. Just prior to licensing beginning, the state put in place emergency rules. Those rules have a lot to do with and explain the application process and also how locations and licensees can operate until the final rules are in place. So the license process has 2 parts to the application. There's a pre-qualification, which is for the person itself or the applicant itself. You can apply with that without having a location. It's just really about you and interested parties, and it's really like a initial vetting process. The second part is location-specific facility licensing. That's when you get as deep as a marketing plan, a facility plan, a site plan, and all of that type of stuff. About a month ago, a little over a month ago, there was a cleanup bill that passed, House Bill 5144, which I'm sure Representative Phelps is very familiar with, and that did a few things. One thing it did was a lot of the CPAs were coming out and saying, well, the application requires a CPA to say that this person has the required amount of capitalization and to actually attest that the person has what the act and what the rules require somebody to have in cash, liquid cash, and in assets. For example, for a Class C grower license, they'll say you have to have $500,000 in assets, of which $125,000 of that has to be in liquid cash. And so the CPAs attest. The CPAs said, well, how do we know that we're protected from prosecution? And so this bill gave CPAs protections. It also gave state financial institutions protections if they were accepting proceeds that were from marijuana sales. So one provision of that cleanup bill said that CPAs and bank institutions are protected from state or local administrative, criminal, or civil sanctions if a CPA attests to someone's application or if a bank institution accepts proceeds. The other thing is it addresses vertical integration, which is the idea that you could have a processor, a grower, and a provisioning center in the same facility. So it really clarified that you can have those 3 in a single facility, and further said that is the only arrangement, as long as you're not traversing a public road, it's the only arrangement where you don't have to use a secure transporter to get from a processor or a grow to a provisioning center. And that bill also gave former caregivers a way of getting rid of their final supply, if you will. So until December of 2018, a licensed grower can bring in a caregiver who would relinquish their license, and that caregiver has 30 days from becoming an employee or 30 days from actually being the licensee to take their entire supply as a caregiver. Under the old act, under the 2008 Act, they can bring their current supply, bring it in legally, get paid for it, and make it part of the seed-to-sale tracking system. So that gave us a way to really eliminate what would create somewhat of a black market for people that were trying to, that were transitioning from being a caregiver to a state licensed facility. And the most, and then in addition to that, there's the advisory board that Dr. Nakadar is on. There was simply a clarification that said that there'd be a few more appointments, and their first meeting would be March of 2018. Lastly, as of last week, February 15th, the state released a universal symbol. So anything that contains THC must have that exact symbol on the medicine, and that's available through the state. You can download it, you can make stickers out of it, you can do whatever you want with it, and so that's a recent development. That February 15th date has also been, some of you may have heard that date. That was a date under Emergency Rule 19, that a location that was given local approval already, authorized by their municipality, if they have their state application in by February 15th, they can continue operating until they get their state approval. So that was a date that's come and gone, and so a lot of people were trying to get their applications in. The most recent, in terms of applications, the most recent stat I found was from like a January 20th article that said there were 20 complete applications as of January 20th. So there may have been a whole bunch that became complete as of February 15th, but the number still is not as much as I think the state had expected. On a local level, what do these ordinances look like? And let's talk a little bit about ordinances. So the state law says that in order for marijuana to exist anywhere, the local municipality, the city, the township, the village, has to say, yes, we authorize it. That's section 205 of the act. And if the municipality authorizes it, they do it through an opt-in process. They say, yes, we're in. And simultaneously or soon after that, they then put an ordinance in place that has certain things in it that says where they can be in relation to other types of buildings and where they can't be. And there's certain things that are considered practical considerations, constituent considerations, and some examples of what, and really the differences between municipalities is usually the buffer distances, the distances that the facilities can be from, against certain things. So if you look at, these are just 4 examples. If you take a look at Ann Arbor has one location restriction, and it's 1,000 feet from a school, K through 12 school, and that's it. So Ann Arbor is a municipality that said, well, we're not that concerned about where this is from a house or a church or any other religious institution or a park or a child care facility. They said, well, they look at the medicinal benefits of it, and if you look at some of their planning minutes and their council minutes, there's a real understanding of a lot of the things that Dr. Nakadar, Dr. Smith have mentioned, and so they say, well, we look at this as a medicine. We don't prevent CVSs from being a certain distance from these other facilities. Why are we preventing marijuana facilities from being a large distance away? We also have Centerline, which did 400 feet from childcare, 200 feet from parks, 400 feet from religious, 400 feet from schools. Lansing, 500 feet childcare, 500 feet from parks, 500 feet from religious, and 1,000 feet from schools. And then Ypsilanti followed Ann Arbor. What's significant about Lansing is they even, and somebody asked this question last time about how the measurement happens. The measurement is typically from lot line to lot line. Lansing took a very practical consideration and said, well, we think it should be from playground equipment because some parks don't have a presence or they're old parks or dilapidated parks. So they said wherever there's playground equipment, we're going to measure from the distance from playground equipment to the facility itself. So that was an interesting provision. Economic benefits at a local level, you have jobs, you have tax revenue, there's an annual filing fee for each facility, and then each local unit of government gets a pro rata share of the state excise fund. There's a 3% tax and a 6% sales tax, and the municipality is getting its 3%, a portion of that 3% based on its facilities. And then you have a couple of real-world examples in Colorado where the $475,000 the municipality received went toward college scholarships, and the city of Denver used marijuana revenue to build a concert hall. And then there's also benefits use of local contractors in addition to the jobs. Public safety, 2014 article out of the University of Texas published on the National Institute of Health website actually found, contrary to what conventional wisdom is, and in fact, any research in this area, peer-reviewed articles, supports the premise in this article, which is that state medical marijuana licensing may be correlated with a reduction of homicide and assault rates and overall crime. And a lot of that has to do with the standard-by deterrent effect. I mean, you have some buildings that may be old and unoccupied and dilapidated. If you put a business there and there are people that occupy it, occupants tend to reduce crime in areas where there would otherwise be not a lot of activity around, and lighting goes in and different things go in, and you have an infrastructure that supports businesses. Harvard Business Review, more recent article, 2017 article, quote, dispensaries were not the crime magnets that they were often described as, but instead reduced crime in their immediate vicinity. And that article actually does a good job of explaining that standard by effect, really strong research, and could almost couldn't really find anything to the contrary compared to these two articles here. And then thanks to the legislator and representatives like Representative Phelps, the state did a good job of putting certain protections in place across the state that really make it so that the local municipalities don't have to do as much. So, for example, on the marketing side of things, there cannot be an advertisement that's visible from a street, sidewalk, park, or public place that advertises a marijuana product. And any products must be marketed as or advertised as medical marijuana for use by a qualified patient or caregiver. And then they must not be marketed to anyone under 17 years of age. Employees, there's a requirement that there's a criminal background check. If there's any charges within the past 10 years, a controlled substance related one, they shall not be hired. And then there's extensive training requirements as well for every employee. Standard operating procedures need to be in place. It's all part of the licensing process. And so to sum it up, I think municipalities should look to their specific interests of their constituents, their specific interests of the medicinal benefit behind marijuana, and come up with policies that are practical and that are supportive of the overall community, and also consider these safety considerations as well. Thank you for your time, and great to be here today.
Thank you. Just before we go into the question and answer portion, I want to recognize a few other elected officials that either just came in, or I apologize, I missed when I announced some of you earlier. The state representative, my colleague, and the representative for this area of the state, we're in his district right now, is Representative Sheldon Neely. He is here right now. He told me not to introduce him, but I want to now. So it's my former colleague and former representative and mayor of Flint, Woodrow Stanley. We have three other members of City Council here. We have Herb Winfrey, City Council President. Eric Mays, Ward 1, he walked in. And Eva Worthing, Ward 9. And I apologize for missing you guys earlier. And then we have two members of the school board here. We've got the president, Diana Wright, and Darren Berry, council member, or board member. So we're going to try to answer these questions with who has the best knowledge of that topic. And you could either try to direct a question towards a member of the panel, or we'll kind of all try to team up and answer the question the best we can so you get the best information possible. And I had some resources printed up, and I brought them today too when it deals to the Licensing Act, which is the bulk of what the legal side of this is we've been talking about. So I'm going to go down here, and I guess who has any questions, let me know, and we'll start.
Thank you. I have a question about the state metric system on how, and the seed to sale. So when you're tracking and monitoring for whether it's a grower or dispensary, somebody mentioned that the current caregivers, there's going to be a lag in time where they can bring their products to a grow or to a dispensary and sell. Will that only be if they integrate, give up their caregiver status to become a part of either dispensary or grow, or could it be a situation? What about caregivers who are not going to give up their status or don't want to give up their status, or live in an area that has not opted in, and they still want to be able to, whether on consignment or directly, give their product to one of these licensed facilities? Is that something, as far as you know, during this period of time? I think you mentioned us to December the 5th. That they would, or something about December where they would be able to do that?
Yeah, good question. So let's start with the Medical Marijuana Act, right? The 2008 Medical Marijuana Act is ingrained in our Constitution. That was a constitutional amendment. It's not going anywhere. There's, as far as we know, there's not going to be a referendum that gets rid of that, and there's really no reason to get rid of that. That patient-to-caregiver model will continue to exist. So if you wanted to remain a caregiver and you wanted to truly continue to serve as your 5 patients, then you have every right to continue doing that. Now, fast forward, what does the Facilities Act say? The Facilities Act, this is a little bit anomalous, but what it says is that you must have, if you're a cultivator or a processor, you must have someone that had 2 years of caregiver experience. Okay. So you must have someone that has 2 years of caregiver experience. However, you cannot employ a caregiver. So effectively, you have to relinquish your license to become involved with a grower. And so, a licensed grower, correct? Yes, a state licensed grower. So once you become an employee, or you yourself are the licensee, and then you have to relinquish your caregiver license. So at that moment, what you can do is you can take whatever supply you had, and you can bring it over to that facility, that grow facility, and you would of course relinquish your caregiver license, and you have to enter the metric system, and that's how that process will work.
But up until then, say it's a caregiver that's not becoming a part of the dispensary or a grow facility ABC. But as you stated, under 208, they're still a caregiver.
Yeah.
They would then just service their patients. They wouldn't be able to bring their product to a grow or a dispensary. Correct. Unless they're going to become a part of it.
Correct. And even after that, they can do that indefinitely. They can remain a caregiver to serve their patients as
Right.
long as they want.
Okay.
Yeah.
They just can't go into the licensed facility as an employee.
I understand. Once they go into the licensed facility,
Yeah, so
either as a worker or a licensee, they have to give up their caregiver status voluntarily.
Yes, correct.
Sounds like the goal is to integrate it more into something trackable and relatable.
Yes.
Yeah, so it's a good question, because this was actually asked by Laura and stuff, so this is something that we had kind of commented on from that standpoint. The question was, how do we start this up? I mean, if you don't allow people to have a startup or any kind of supply starting, you're gonna have a lot of patients that have nowhere to go because nobody can just make it come out of nowhere. So that was really kind of the whole point, was to say, how can we transition that over? People that are kind of moving into that will allow them to phase what they have into the whole situation, so that allows for a smoother transition if you're going that way.
And at the risk of hogging all the questions, and I'll say this and be quiet. So let's use an example. City of Flint comes up with ordinances allowing the caregivers or the dispensaries and grows, they're being approved. So, but they then still have a class of people that are caregivers that are not integrating into that. Is there any type of discussion you've heard on a state level on dealing with that dynamic?
Well, that's really going to be left up to the cities to deal with again, because the caregivers are going to be allowed to possess 72 plants if they have their patients and everything from that standpoint. The city can impose ordinances on those situations as well. So other cities have taken charge of the home grows and homes actually being taken over as grow facilities by doing such things, saying, hey, look, this has to be a dwelling you're living in. You can only use so many square feet of that dwelling to do your caregiver activities and so on and so forth. Some will allow them to be in commercial spaces as long as they've also gone through that thing, even though it's just their own 72 plants, as long as their plant comes. So it all just depends on the municipality, but they, again, have that ability to make rules to curb or limit that. And that is actually a concern for a lot of communities, because they have places where houses are blowing up and, those kind of things. So that really does need to be kind of addressed from that standpoint, from a safety standpoint, and just quality control in general. You don't really want things, processed and things made in the garage, from that standpoint anyway. So I think it's important to really understand what it is that works and what it is that doesn't work from that standpoint. And this is the time where knowing these issues and understanding them really helps kind of formulate plans that work for this as a practical situation.
For the constituents that are worried about the neighbor next door growing, what do you think, or is there research on these facilities opening up the medical marijuana and maybe seeing less like homegrown and like the traffic in and out from that?
Right. I think, I'll let you talk about it. I deal with a lot of the caregivers and different people kind of in this industry throughout my different experiences. I think that will help the whole situation at home, because the people who are really trying to do this on a larger scale are the ones that are taking over a home and using every space of it and having multiple homes and trying to do different operations from that standpoint, just because they don't have the infrastructure and the facilities to do this on a commercial level. So as those people transition over, you will see quite a reduction in that overall. But again, you're always going to have a few people that just cultivate their own 12 plants or small gardens that aren't really a nuisance or otherwise an issue in the community. So that's really what has to be determined, is how do you allow people to still do what they can do by the law in a proper fashion without it becoming a nuisance to the community.
I just want to add one portion to that. I think that you probably will see a lot of people who are caregivers now either transition in or start to die out, because they don't have that component where they can take their access and give it to or sell it to a dispensary. And I've kind of got mixed feelings about that, because it takes kind of an economic component out of that for those individuals, but they have no legal way to sell the access unless they're giving it to their patients or their caregivers for legally anyway. So I think it will start to really limit the number of caregivers as a whole. So.
And just to piggyback off that point briefly, I think the best way to reduce the home growth, which people have a problem with, quite frankly, I think that's the tone of your question, right? Is to pass an ordinance. To pass an ordinance, and those guys would then become employees or the licensees themselves. So the quicker ordinance is passed, the better and more friendly they are to the marijuana industry, then the sooner that those guys go away.
Okay, the first time I was here, I asked the question of what's being done in the legislature for the education community, teachers, well, just staff members, period. And I was just wondering, is there any policy change happening in state legislature? And I'm glad that Representative Neely is here. So is there anything happening that way that would protect our employees? Because if they're caught right now through any testing, and we don't test like that, but if it happens, they're fired. And so is there going to be something coming out of legislature that's going to protect the employees of the school districts?
And I think that, so we talked about that a few weeks ago or a month ago when we had this, and I've been working in Lansing with Representative Neely and some others. There's a couple of reps, especially from like the Ann Arbor area, that are working on this too. Our roadblock seems to be the majority caucus right now on this, because we feel that if you have to go to the doctor to get referred for this, we know that, there's some times there, there's some people that have been accused of, operating in a not so wholesome way, I guess. But as a whole, we think that we approved this for a reason, and if it's a true medical benefit to these individuals, they should be able to seek treatment that way. But we continue to get pushback from the majority caucus, and the amount that they outnumber us by is so much that we would have to pull off a good number of we'd have to get over half of their caucus to agree, so over half, because they get to decide everything that goes up for a vote, every single thing. So what they do is before it even goes up for a vote in front of the whole body, they split off together what's called the caucus, which is in a private room, no cameras, no microphones, and they have to hold an internal vote. And if they don't have at least 51% of their membership that says, yes, I'll support that, they won't bring it up for a vote on the House floor. And that's kind of where we've been stuck on some of these things, because we think that, not just for teachers, we think for a lot of people, that if this is what your doctor says is a legit medical treatment, then we want to be able to have people seek that relief that way. We do understand that potentially, like heavy equipment operation, things like that, there's definitely going to be limitations, but there's also those limitations for narcotic substances like a Vicodin or other types of medicine that might make you drowsy. There's restrictions with that as well. So, but we are working on it. I wanted to make sure before that there was legislation that was introduced that said people can't get fired, but actually we can try to work with you to get the sponsors' information and everything on that too. So, but yeah, we're trying right now, but I don't know if it's going to come this term or not.
Okay, for the lawyer, I'm not. All right, so, okay, so Sessions rescinds the Cole memo, but the Cole memo kind of talked about recreational states to a certain extent. He didn't rescind the Oakton memo, which predates the Cole memo, it's particularly for establishing the safety protocols for medical states. Does that play a factor? I don't know. What's from
Right. I mean, what I gleaned from he references the Cole memo, and the memo prior to the Cole memo pointed to its predecessor memo, the one that you just mentioned as well. And so there has been a lot of talk about, they're really going after the recreational states more than the medical states. So the memo didn't necessarily speak to the term recreational, but I think what was gleaned was, well, how far are these states going, and when does the government believe it's too far? And so the idea behind those memos was we're really going to stay hands off to the extent that there's no violation, to the extent that there's a framework in place and the state has chose to put the certain framework in place. This memo is saying, well, the state may have chose to do something and chose to put a framework in place, but we're not prevented from taking action. We're not going to put a statement out there that says we're not going to necessarily take action. But again, looking back to the first paragraph of the memo, it sounds like they're looking at more of the ancillary offenses, the residual offenses, if you will, rather than directly at the production or distribution of marijuana through a state law.
Thank you. And for Dr. Nakadar, I did see raw cannabis listed in your slides. I don't know if you're doing any research on raw cannabis, but it's non-decarboxylated. It's often juiced like wheatgrass, and it doesn't turn up in a drug test because it's not the same cannabinoid profile. But we've seen a lot of really great things with our patients with raw cannabis juice. It's non-psychoactive, things of that nature.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of different cannabinoid products that have different effectiveness. Again, it really goes down to individual and how we kind of build their regimen. We typically start with THC products and test the patient's tolerance to that initially, and then we introduce other cannabinoid products from CBD, even juicing, from that standpoint. And yeah, it has quite a bit of an effect when you combine the THC with other cannabinoids. We typically, in any situation, once we've kind of maxed out on how much THC someone can consume based on how it affects them, and that's the main thing to kind of understand. We're talking about doses that don't get you high. And when you're using THC, that's the limiting factor, the milligrams of THC you're using based on someone's tolerance. Whenever we reach that limit, we'll add a CBD component, and that's usually about 4 to 6 hours afterward. It's really when you get the most effectiveness of that cannabinoid product when taken that much time after a THC product. So those are just some of the kind of newer information and kind of studies that are kind of coming out in terms of the effectiveness and how to kind of combine and use these products. But yeah, there is a variety of different products, and different people find benefit from them. And sometimes it is just a matter of getting them through the process of trying these different combinations and products to find a regimen that works well for them. Not every patient benefits, but there is a lot of benefit across the board. One of the other things I was going to mention earlier for the school board question was, employees can also start to, I guess, ask for these things as well. So as a teachers union and other things, they can, explain the right way and understanding that can always be something that they bring up in terms of their contract negotiations and things like that as something that they want changed in terms of how things are going. So how the political game really kind of muddies up the waters in terms of what's practical sometimes, but sometimes that's empowering the people will always kind of help establish that need and kind of sway people's minds a lot of times. So that'd be another suggestion is to kind of talk to the teachers union and get a feel for how they feel with that and try to help them out from that.
And just before we go on, I wanted to address that as well on the school board side. There is, and I believe this is what Rep. Phelps was referring to. Coincidentally, I noticed this bill was introduced like a couple days after the last time we were here, and this is House Bill 5445 that prevents termination of employment of medical marijuana patients. So that's the bill I believe that your colleagues introduced, and so that's right now an introduced bill. And I've been fumbling through my email this whole time trying to find it. So I finally dug it up so we can have more of a conversation offline about that.
So you said it was House Bill 5445?
5445, yes.
Thank you.
Any other questions? No more votes.
So on the metric system. So from what my understanding is there's these third parties that you can contract if you're a dispensary or grow facility for your seed to sale accountability. I heard something to the effect of they may be making either software or a VPN where if you wanted to have an internal IT person where you can attempt to do that directly yourself without the expense of a third party, or even if you're concerned about the privacy of a third party, then they work with many different people in inherent conflict of interest that may be there. Is there any information you have where that's going to be made a little more user-friendly or something that's actually doable by a low-tech licensee that can get a hard software at their own location to deal with that level of tracking? And how would that affect the growth, of transportation group? That's not necessarily, they're transporting other people's products, so how would that work with them, if you know?
Yeah, no, the metric system itself is going to be kind of let's say a system level that's up here. Below that, you'll have different software companies and different people that can develop things that connect to the metric system. So to your question, yes, you can contract with third-party software, or you can have someone in-house build something that meets the requirements and can communicate with the broader system that's tracking everything. In terms of transportation, it would still go through the tracking system. So anything that they take in, I believe, will be tracked, and then wherever it goes and gets dropped off will all be tracked as part of the system.
And as far as the transport, is my understanding, because I'm dealing with one group potentially there, that is almost like a flight plan. They would have to file their as they go, and it would in real time. Is that your understanding?
I can't say I know to that detail about exactly what the requirements are for how real time it is.
When I was reading the law, that's what it seemed like to me. Talking to Lewis and people up at law, it seemed like that's how that would work.
It's all supposed to be real time. I just don't know the details of exactly how
like they wouldn't have a specific route every time, but as they get ready to do something, they would lay that route in their face with the state police. They would have the ability to know in real time where these routes are in case they want to pull over and check. Is that my understanding?
I don't think it's to that extent, but those will be some things that I think we'll start to understand a little bit more as the licensing act, because not all the rules are developed yet. So those might be things they're discussing now as part of things that they want to do for that area. And I'll be honest with you, that's probably one area where I haven't had too much involvement in development or kind of understanding what they're even looking for from that end of it.
Well, when I looked at the statute, it just literally said for the transportation, your drivers simply had to have a chauffeur's license and no points. And in essence, even if they were felons, they just had to be 5 years out from probation, parole, or release to be able to drive. And I guess, a lot of the licensees don't want to actually be boots on the ground driving. They want to make it where you can have, and an unmarked vehicle with just simply sealed containers for money or product. And so it wasn't necessarily armed cars or any of those type of specifications. And whatever you were going to drive just didn't need to be labeled according to the statute and emergency rules that I read. Is that your understanding?
Yeah, yes, and I would expect to see some additional emergency rules that come as these initial secure transports start to get licensed. Because your questions are the ones that nobody's really thought about until it comes time to put a business plan together and start ramping up operations. And you say, all right, well, how do we actually do this? So I think those are the conversations that are being had right now. Those are all really good questions about the logistical side of things. So yeah, I don't know that I don't know how much thought's gone into those things, but I would think that those conversations are being had now.
Yeah, I'll probably wore Lewis to death over at the Laura, because when I was asking those questions, he was referring me back to the law, and the law was silent on those questions. So I know, and as far as you know as well, there's still no regulation from the state in terms of pricing. That the market is going to determine what the pricing will be for transportation costs, for testing costs, your testing facility. Those two in particular. Well, all of it, from what I understand, they're going to allow the market to determine those costs.
I haven't heard anything otherwise. I don't know if Representative Phelps has. I've heard nothing other than.
There's a current market already, so it'll really just kind of transition in. I don't think there's going to be much of a,
Right. So really, I guess for transportation and testing would be the ones where the prices would be.
Well, there's testing now, so I mean, there's facilities that test now. So I mean, those things are already kind of standardized and kind of will transition into the whole situation. And to that point, I mean, I don't think that they've developed enough of the situation on the transport side, anyways. And there really, I as far as I know, there hadn't been any applicants for that license as of yet either. So that may have changed in the last couple of weeks.
I want to add to that portion too. So we're not going to, the way we designed the original law, that these administrative rules, so these smaller portions of the law, like how their rules will have to be determined and things like that, that commission is going to be who decides the administrative processes. And these board meetings, they have a list of all the meetings, and I've actually printed out the schedule for all the upcoming meetings of this board. So if you guys, anybody here is actually interested in knowing when this group is going to meet, and potentially, because you could probably ask the members of that board and bring it up to their attention. On this table here, on your way out, you can grab one of those calendars of the upcoming meetings, because if you have a lot of questions, that is the absolute best people to ask, because they are not only the ones that know the answer, but they're the ones that created the answer. So, any other questions? I don't see any other questions here, so I guess, unless you guys have anything else to add, I think we're wrapped up today. There's still plenty of food. I think if anyone didn't get a chance to eat, you know, it was fantastic. So you might as well want to fix a plate or take something home. And I think other than that, is there any other portion of the agenda that we have? No? All right. Well, thank you all for coming. Appreciate it. So they're gonna, we gotta hold it. Okay. All right.
Thank you.
Yeah. I think the crowd was different this time than last time too.
Which is good.
And so I was hoping it would be a little bit bigger, but it doesn't. I think enough politicians came too. So, but my friend Scott, he's in the suit at my table. I had him go through, but we just did this 2 days ago. Was all the advanced time because I got the flyer from you guys on Friday or whatever. But he went through and we made a list of all the dispensaries in town, and we gave one of the flyers to all the dispensaries that we could get to that were open.
Yeah.
And then on about partway through his trip, he started stopping at all the grow supplies. So like all the industry, even though they're not a regulated portion,
Right.
You know what I mean? They still have
People who
a vested
are
interest in the health of the
100%.
industry. Yeah. So.
They usually are. They're just when they're there, they're doing gross stuff, but then they go home. And...
Oh, right. That's true too. I didn't even think about it like that. So, but yeah, this is great. I really appreciate you guys doing this, and thanks for.
And if you ever think of situations or venues where we think that this might be beneficial and kind of help out in terms of the talk with, even if it's a smaller group, bigger group, whatever.
That's fantastic. Actually, I'm Representative Tim Shaw. He had to go to a different event, but he asked if he could see your guys' reasons through yours.
Okay.
But I didn't know if you guys are willing to share those or not. But I just like if there's a way you might be able to save it into a PDF, or if you could just email.
I think this one was actually recorded.
Okay.